I didn't say a word when Margaret Thornfield, the HOA president, started screaming about property damage and unauthorized installations. I just placed the state renewable energy exemption certificate on the conference table, followed by the federal Environmental Protection Act violation notice I'd filed that morning, and watched her lawyer's face drain of color as he read the $50,000 per day fine schedule. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Margaret's perfectly manicured finger, which had been jabbing accusingly in my direction just seconds before, slowly lowered as she realized that her aesthetic standards had just cost the Homeowners Association more money than their annual budget. What she didn't know yet was that this was just the beginning. 6 months earlier, my life had been beautifully simple. After 23 years of teaching high school physics, I'd finally saved enough to buy the little ranch house at the end of Maple Grove Lane that I'd been driving past for a decade. It wasn't much to look at from the street, a modest 2-story, with faded blue siding and a wraparound porch that needed some love. But it sat on 3 acres of rolling hills, with mature oak trees, and a view of the valley that made my chest tight with gratitude every morning. I'd moved there specifically because I wanted space to breathe, to garden, to finally build the workshop I'd been dreaming about since my divorce 5 years prior. The house came with southern exposure that was absolutely perfect for solar panels. And after years of watching my electric bills climb while my teacher's salary stayed flat, I saw it as the perfect opportunity to finally go off-grid like I'd always wanted. The neighborhood was the kind of place where people minded their own business. Most of the houses were older, owned by retirees or young families who'd bought before the area got expensive. Everyone had big lots, well-maintained, but not obsessively manicured. Kids rode bikes in the street. People waved when they drove by. The HOA existed, technically, but their monthly newsletter mostly covered reminders about trash pickup and updates on the community center roof repair fund. I paid my dues automatically and never gave it much thought. That should have been my first mistake. I spent my first month just settling in, unpacking boxes, getting to know my neighbors, and planning my projects. The solar installation was my top priority, done the calculations, and with the state rebates and federal tax credits, the system would pay for itself in 7 years. I'd already gotten quotes from 3 different companies and was ready to move forward with Solar Tech Solutions, a local installer with excellent reviews. I pulled the permits from the county, which approved them without question since my property had optimal sun exposure and no zoning restrictions. The installation was scheduled for the first week of October, right when the autumn light would give me a good baseline for winter energy production. That's when I got my first letter from the Maple Grove Homeowners Association. It arrived on a Tuesday, printed on official letterhead with Margaret Thornfield's name embossed at the bottom as president. The language was formal, but condescending. Dear Mr. Ramirez, it has come to our attention that you are planning to install solar panels on your property without proper approval from the Architectural Review Committee. Please be advised that all exterior modifications must be submitted for review 30 days prior to installation. Failure to comply with this requirement may result in fines and forced removal of non-compliant installations. I read it twice, confused. I'd looked through the HOA covenants when I bought the house. They covered basic things like no commercial vehicles parked on the street and no structures over 6 feet tall without approval. Solar panels weren't mentioned anywhere. I called the number on the letterhead and left a polite voicemail explaining that I'd already pulled county permits and asking for clarification on the approval process. Nobody called me back. A week later, I received another letter, this one marked urgent in red letters. The tone had shifted from condescending to threatening. Mr. Ramirez, you have failed to respond to our previous correspondence regarding your planned solar installation. Be advised that the Architectural Review Committee has unanimously determined that solar panels are not in keeping with the aesthetic standards of Maple Grove and will not be approved under any circumstances. Any installation that proceeds without approval will be subject to immediate removal and fines of $200 per day until compliance is achieved. This time, I didn't call. I drove directly to Margaret Thornfield's house, a massive colonial with a perfectly manicured lawn and not a single tree or shrub out of place. She answered the door, wearing a cardigan despite the October heat, and looked at me like I was selling something she didn't want. When I introduced myself and tried to explain my confusion about the solar panel policy, she cut me off with a dismissive wave of her hand. The decision has been made, Mr. Ramirez. Solar panels are unsightly and will negatively impact property values for everyone in the neighborhood. Surely you can understand that we have standards to maintain. When I mentioned that solar panels were environmentally responsible and would actually increase my property value, she literally laughed. Environmental responsibility doesn't trump community standards. Find another way to save money on your electric bill. I left that conversation with a cold knot in my stomach. Not because I was angry. I'd dealt with difficult administrators and helicopter parents for decades, but because I recognized the tone. Margaret Thornfield wasn't interested in community standards or property values. She was interested in control, and she'd decided that I was someone who needed to be put in my place. That night, I canceled my solar installation appointment and started reading. I spent the next 2 weeks diving deep into HOA law, renewable energy legislation, and property rights. What I found was fascinating and infuriating in equal measure. Texas had passed comprehensive solar access laws back in 2011 that explicitly prohibited HOAs from banning solar installations. The Texas Property Code was crystal clear. A property owners association may not include or enforce a provision in a dedicatory instrument that prohibits or restricts a property owner from installing solar energy devices. Not only that, but the law included specific language about unreasonable aesthetic restrictions and gave homeowners the right to pursue legal action for violations. But the real revelation came when I dug into the federal level. The Energy Policy Act, updated in 2018, included provisions that classified interference with renewable energy installations as environmental violations, subject to EPA enforcement. The fines started at $25,000 per day and escalated rapidly for repeat offenses. HOAs that violated federal renewable energy protections weren't just breaking civil law, they were potentially committing federal environmental crimes. Armed with this knowledge, I sent Margaret Thornfield a certified letter outlining the relevant statutes and requesting that the HOA rescind their solar panel prohibition. I kept the tone professional and educational, including copies of the relevant legal codes, and explaining that I had no desire for conflict, but was prepared to proceed with installation under state and federal protections. The letter was delivered on a Thursday. By Saturday, I had a response. This time, Margaret didn't bother with letterhead. She'd handwritten a note on personal stationery. Mr. Ramirez, I don't care what you think the law says. The HOA board has spoken, and solar panels will not be permitted in Maple Grove under any circumstances. Install them and see what happens. At the bottom, she'd added what I can only describe as a threat. People who don't fit in here tend to find reasons to leave. That's when I stopped trying to negotiate and started building my case. The first thing I did was document everything. I photographed every letter, recorded the dates and times of all our interactions, and created a detailed timeline of the HOA's actions. Then I started researching Margaret Thornfield and the rest of the board. What I found was a pattern of petty tyranny that went back years. They'd forced one neighbor to remove a vegetable garden because it was inappropriate for front yard landscaping. They'd fined another family $2,000 for painting their shutters the wrong shade of green. Most telling, they'd recently filed a lawsuit against a retired veteran who'd installed a flagpole in his backyard, claiming it violated height restrictions despite the fact that federal law explicitly protects veterans' rights to display the American flag. But the real smoking gun came when I requested copies of the HOA's financial records. Texas law requires HOAs to provide these documents to homeowners upon request, and what I found was shocking. Margaret and her board had been treating the association's funds like their personal piggy bank. They'd authorized $15,000 for landscaping improvements that turned out to be new flower beds around Margaret's house. They'd spent $8,000 on legal consultations with Margaret's brother-in-law's law firm for issues that could have been handled with simple phone calls. Most egregiously, they'd been paying themselves administrative fees that weren't authorized anywhere in the HOA covenants. By November, I had built an airtight case, but I still hoped to resolve things quietly. I scheduled my solar installation for the first week of December and sent one final letter to the HOA board, this time from my attorney. The letter was polite but firm. I was proceeding with installation under state and federal renewable energy protections. The HOA's prohibition was legally invalid, and any interference would result in immediate legal action. I gave them 10 days to respond. They responded by showing up at my house while the installation crew was working. I was in my kitchen making coffee when I heard shouting outside. Through the window, I could see Margaret Thornfield and 2 other board members standing in my driveway, screaming at the solar tech installers who were up on my roof. Margaret was waving a piece of paper and demanding that they stop work immediately. The crew foreman, a calm guy named Dave, who'd been installing solar for 15 years, was trying to explain that they had all the proper permits, but Margaret wasn't listening. She was threatening to call the police, to sue the company, to have their business license revoked. That's when I walked outside with my phone, recording, and calmly asked Margaret to leave my property. She spun around and launched into a tirade about property values and community standards and how I was destroying the neighborhood. When I reminded her that I was acting within my legal rights, she screamed, "We'll see about that," and stormed off. The next morning, I woke up to find that someone had vandalized my solar panels overnight. They'd used spray paint to cover half the panels, with the word eyesore in large red letters. The damage was extensive enough that the panels would need to be cleaned professionally before they could function properly. I called the police, filed a report, and had the vandalism documented with photographs. I also called my attorney, but Margaret wasn't done. That afternoon, while I was at work, she returned with a crew from Thornfield Property Services, which I later discovered was her son's landscaping company, and had them remove my solar panels entirely. They didn't just uninstall them. They damaged my roof in the process, leaving gaps in the shingles and exposed electrical connections. When I came home to find my investment destroyed and my roof compromised, I realized that Margaret Thornfield had just made the biggest mistake of her life. The next morning, I walked into the Texas State Environmental Protection Agency office in Austin with a folder full of documentation. I filed a formal complaint alleging that the Maple Grove HOA had willfully violated federal renewable energy protections, destroyed permitted renewable energy infrastructure, and interfered with environmentally protected installations. The EPA agent who took my report, a sharp woman named Maria Santos, listened to my story with growing amazement. In 15 years of environmental enforcement, she told me, I've never seen an HOA this blatantly violate federal law. They didn't just break the rules. They destroyed evidence and caused environmental damage in the process. Within 48 hours, the EPA had opened a formal investigation. Within a week, they'd served the HOA with a notice of violation and scheduled a mandatory hearing. The fines were calculated at $50,000 per day from the date of the panel removal, with additional penalties for environmental damage and destruction of permitted infrastructure. By the time Margaret received the notice, the HOA was already facing over $400,000 in federal fines. But I wasn't finished. Using the financial records I'd obtained, I filed a complaint with the Texas Attorney General's office, alleging that the HOA board had misappropriated homeowners' funds for personal use. I also filed a civil lawsuit for destruction of property, harassment, and violation of my renewable energy rights. The Texas Solar Access Act included provisions for treble damages, meaning I could recover 3 times the cost of my destroyed panels plus attorney fees. The community meeting where all of this came to light was the most satisfying hour of my life. Margaret had called the meeting to discuss the solar panel situation, clearly expecting to rally the neighbors against me. Instead, she found herself facing a room full of homeowners who'd just learned that their HOA fees had been misappropriated, and that they were collectively facing nearly $500,000 in federal fines because of her vendetta against my solar panels. The meeting started with Margaret's usual performance dramatic gestures, dire warnings about property values, appeals to community standards. But when she finished her presentation and asked for questions, I stood up with my folder of documents. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't interrupt. I just methodically presented the evidence. The EPA violation notice, the Attorney General's investigation, the financial records showing misappropriated funds, and the legal precedents establishing that her solar panel prohibition was illegal under both state and federal law. The room was dead silent as I read the EPA's preliminary fine calculation, $50,000 per day, with additional penalties for willful environmental destruction, when I explained that the fines would be assessed against the HOA as a whole, meaning every homeowner would be responsible for paying their share. You could feel the mood shift. Margaret tried to interrupt, to claim that I was lying or exaggerating, but I simply handed copies of the EPA notice to the homeowners sitting nearest to me and let them pass the documents around. By the time I finished speaking, Margaret Thornfield was no longer the voice of authority in that room. She was a liability that every homeowner wanted to distance themselves from as quickly as possible. The aftermath was swift and thorough. Margaret and the entire HOA board resigned within a week. The homeowners voted to dissolve the existing HOA structure and restart with new bylaws that explicitly protected renewable energy installations. The EPA agreed to reduce the fines to $75,000, still substantial, but manageable when spread across the 43 households in the subdivision, in exchange for the HOA implementing mandatory renewable energy protections and environmental compliance training. My civil lawsuit settled out of court for the full cost of my solar panel replacement, roof repairs, and attorney fees, plus additional damages for harassment and violation of my renewable energy rights. The settlement included a clause requiring the new HOA to publicly apologize for the violation of my rights and to send a letter to every homeowner explaining the importance of renewable energy protections. Most satisfying of all, Margaret Thornfield's son's landscaping company lost their contract with the HOA and was required to pay restitution for the illegal removal of my solar panels. The EPA investigation revealed that they dumped the damaged panels in an unauthorized location, creating additional environmental violations that resulted in a separate fine and cleanup order. 6 months later, my solar panels are working perfectly, and my electric bill averages about $12 a month. 3 other neighbors have installed solar systems of their own, and the new HOA board has been nothing but supportive. The community center now has educational displays about renewable energy, and the HOA newsletter regularly features articles about environmental sustainability. Margaret Thornfield moved away last spring. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she couldn't afford the special assessment for the EPA fines and had to sell her house to pay her share. The new owners are a young couple with twin toddlers who wave enthusiastically whenever they see me in the yard. They planted a vegetable garden in their front yard, something that would have sent Margaret into apoplectic. Rajand asked me for advice about installing their own solar system. Now when I sit on my porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the valley while my solar panels soak up the last rays of daylight, I think about the lesson Margaret Thornfield learned too late. when you decide to destroy something that's protected by federal law, you'd better make sure you understand what you're up against, because sometimes the quiet neighbor who just wants to be left alone turns out to be the one person in the room who actually knows how to read the law. The HOA still sends me their monthly newsletter, and I still pay my dues automatically. The difference is that now the newsletter includes a standing reminder about renewable energy rights and environmental protections. And every month, right there on the masthead, there's a small solar panel logo with the motto, Maple Grove, a sustainable community. Some battles are worth fighting, others are worth winning.